So if everybody recalls the last episode on the 356, you'll recall that we were having issues with some rough running when it's under load, when it's going uphill. You'll also recall that after checking some other things, it was felt that the issue was undersized main jets and venturis in the Solex carburetors. So that was addressed, and it did not result in any kind of improvement at all. So from there, with the help of a friend of mine who's a longtime car guy, second generation classic car guy, we delved in back to the fundamentals, which I had done following the engine rebuild, but not trusting my own handiwork. I was grateful to have somebody else come in and kind of go back through it. So we started all the way from the point of this cylinder one on the compression stroke on top dead center. In other words, you know, the distributor, it fires 1432 on these cars, just like an old VW, and validated the ignition wires, went to the appropriate cylinders, validated, like I said, top dead center was where it was supposed to be. I checked the static timing. It was 5-6 degrees before top dead center, where you want it. We checked it at about 3,000 RPM, and it was advanced about 33 degrees, again, about where you want it. I checked the level of the floats in the carburetors, the float chambers, to make sure they were either not starving the car of fuel under high acceleration, or vice versa, overflowing and flooding the car. So that was okay. Checked the mixture again. It was a little bit rich, leaned it out to where it should be. That resulted in nothing whatsoever. And I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. The coil's new. It was checked. It had the appropriate resistance across the primary and secondary coils in the coil. We validated it's got a good spark. The distributor was rebuilt thoroughly when the engine was out of the car, so it doesn't have an issue in terms of, you know, sometimes when they wear out, there's some slop in there in the shaft within the distributor that goes to the rotor on top, and it can result in some, you know, dwell angle variations, which you don't want. So really, we started scratching our heads and saying, well, you know, we're kind of scratching off the list of typical suspects here. So at that point, we started questioning, well, it sounds still like a fuel starvation issue, so let's check the fuel pump, which we did. We felt like the pressure coming out of the fuel pump was a little weak. So then I started thinking about it and said, well, I never rebuilt the fuel pump when the engine was out of the car. And that's really what I should have done, because it is way easier to access the fuel pump with the engine out, because when the engine's out, you don't have all that shrouding all over it as you have with an air-cooled engine to direct the flow of air where it's needed. So the fuel pump is a little difficult to access because there's a piece of that shrouding underneath it that blocks access to the lower stud. There's two studs and two nuts that hold that fuel pump up to the block. You can't get at that underneath one from the top because it's underneath it, and you can't get to it from underneath until you remove that piece of shrouding, which, hold on, I'll show you. This is it. This is it right here. The fuel pump actually sits above this, and you definitely can't get this. This is actually shaped for that lower stud and nut. You can see there's a little variation right there. And I did have to wrestle this thing out. You can tell I did a little bit of bending right there, which I'll have to straighten back out before this goes back in. But the fuel pump is out. It's sitting on the bench. We're going to go over there and we're going to rebuild it, and we're going to see if that's the issue. I'm hoping when I pull it apart and get to the diaphragm itself that I see some obvious degradation there, probably due to using fuel with ethanol in it, which I never do, and neither should you. So we'll take a look at that. I'll show you how to rebuild it. I'll show you what comes with the rebuild kit. We'll get it back in the car, and we'll see the result. So stay tuned. So the fuel pump is out on the bench. As you can see, I also received the rebuild kit, which we're going to open in a second, and get that laid out for you so you can see all the various bits and pieces that come with it, as contained in this little bag. So we'll do that in a second. I do have a little bit of concern immediately, and this sounds weird, but I'm afraid this may have already been rebuilt. You can see the shininess of the springs down here. So why should that concern me? Well, because I am hoping that this is the reason that the car's been running poorly, after having checked everything else, as you saw in the, earlier. So next up, we're going to open up the fuel pump. There's a little screen up here. We'll check that out. Then we'll take off all these screws. We'll see the condition of the diaphragm, which, again, weirdly, I'm hoping it's messed up, because that will explain a lot. But we'll see. Typically, I would expect to see these springs a little more, you know, a little less shiny. But who knows? We'll see. Stay tuned. So here's our rebuild kit kind of laid out, so you can see everything it comes with. This one happens to come from Stoddard. You can see the part number there. So you can see it comes with everything you need. Here's the diaphragm that we're kind of hoping is the culprit. It comes with a new screen on the top. Obviously new screws, which are the ones that hold the two halves together. I don't know. I think those super shiny screws are going to look really strange with this 57-year-old pump, so probably won't use those, but they're pretty. New gaskets, of course. That little horseshoe shaped thing, you get a new one of those too. It holds, it goes on the end of the shaft there and holds the that spring in. So you can see the outer spring, inner spring. We need a little 8mm wrench. That's for that nut right there to access the old one of these. And of course a screwdriver to get all these screws out. And we'll need another tool. We're going to have to compress this spring even more and remove the clip from the end. And as you'll see in a little while, that hole right there has a shaft that goes into it, the other end of which sticks out the bottom of the fuel pump. This is the end that actually the distributor pushes on. This thing goes in and out, and it's what makes the pumping action. So when this thing's reinserted in the engine into that space I showed you earlier, all of this is internal to the engine, and this is what is actually creating the pumping motion. So pretty simple, but effective. So first off, I already loosened this tiny little bolt, again, 8mm across the flat. So we'll take it off first, and I'm going to get another little magnetic dish to hold my old parts in so they don't get lost. So I got to do that, and apparently I need both hands to do this. So I'm going to remove this. We'll take a look at the old little screen. Then I'm going to remove those screws, and we'll look at the diaphragm. So that's coming up in a minute. So I removed this lid. I just put a little Phillips in here to kind of pry it. Came right off. So there's the old screen, and if you compare that to the new screen, you can see they look quite a bit different. So we'll be replacing that. This gasket that was sitting over here is that gasket. So we'll be replacing that. I noticed that some of it's left over on here, so we're gonna clean that up so it mates really well. So yeah, that's where we're at. And here you can see the old gasket. Don't need that. And you can see the old screen. Yeah, there's some crud. So we'll be replacing that with this when we reassemble. But first, let's get at this guy. All right, so here we see inside, we got to the diaphragm. It doesn't look awful. I don't see any obvious issues. But what happens is with ethanol, with fuel that has ethanol in it, up to 10% ethanol, ethanol eats away at some of these things. You know, modern cars were designed around it. These old cars were not, and you really want to use non-ethanol fuel. It costs a little more, it's a little harder to find, but there's plenty of phone apps out there that will actually show you a little map of the nearest gas stations that carry non-ethanol fuel. I am lucky enough to have one fairly close that actually has 93 octane non-ethanol, and that's the only thing I put in all my old cars. So anyway, we're going to ensure, if this is the issue, that it doesn't ever happen again to that diaphragm, because we are never going to put fuel with ethanol in it back in this car. So with that, let's free up this diaphragm. We need to remove this clip right here, and then that'll allow us to pull this diaphragm out and replace it with the new one. So that's next. So I got a little creative here to remove that clip. See where that groove is at the end of that shaft? So this spring and that cap were on the end, as you recall earlier. I actually made use of this little hole in my toolbox, top razor lower. I put it in here, which compressed that spring and top, because the spring and top are bigger than that hole, but the clip that holds it in is smaller, so it exposed the end of that shaft, and I just used a screwdriver to pop the clip off. And strangely, after I did that, and see now inside you can see the bigger spring, which is on the inside, and you also see a little pin, which should be holding on this upper diaphragm, but you can see it came right out. So there is our old diaphragm, the one that we suspect. Here is that inner spring, okay, and here's the shaft onto which the diaphragm fits there. Again, this other spring fits on the other end. Excuse me. It's a good thing that a new clip comes with this, because the old one went flying. Wear your safety glasses. I have no idea where it went, but it doesn't matter because I have a new one. All right, let's start reassembling. So we're going to put the new diaphragm on this end of the shaft. We're going to hold it in with this pin. We're going to put the spring back in. We're going to put the diaphragm with the shaft back in all the way through. We're going to reinsert, I shouldn't say reinsert, we're going to insert the new clippy thing that holds all of this together. Remember, this goes on the end. We'll compress the spring again. We'll insert the new clip, and we will be good to go. Alrighty, more to come. Okay, so it's a little bit of a pain because what happens is, if you'll recall, this larger spring that's inside the body, that has to be over the shaft attached to the diaphragm, so it has to be compressed. And at the same time, or afterwards if you do it like me, you have to compress the smaller spring, which used to be that long, so that you can put that little clip, if you can see it, it's a little bit brass colored, down in there. And this cup that retains the spring has an indentation into which that little C-clip sits in. So it actually it keeps that C-clip in, and it keeps the spring retained, compressed. So what I did was rig up this highly impressive little apparatus here to keep the diaphragm from shooting out while I'm also at the same time trying to compress that smaller spring. So I just used this piece of metal. I used one of the screws from the lid. The holes didn't quite line up. Man, that would have been nice. If I did this frequently, I would definitely do something like this with the right holes, and then you can just put screws in. I just used, obviously, a pair of vice grips to hold the other side. So at this point, this shaft is being retained by the clip and the spring force pushing it that way. The spring in here is wanting to go back this way, but this is all retaining it. So we can now release this end. No longer needed, because as you can see, the diaphragm, as I said, is being retained by that spring. Okay? It's an interesting little assembly. That pin that I showed you earlier that holds the diaphragm to the shaft, nothing holds it in place except for the body of the fuel pump itself. So you have to keep that pin in place, keep it so that gravity doesn't make it fall out. Put that spring over, shove that whole thing in. Once it's in far enough, the body of the pump itself holds that pin in place. Keep one of these things, keep this screw handy, push this on, put that screw in, swing it over, and at that point it's not going to come out. I clipped it down further so that the shaft would extend far enough to put that clip in on this side, which you can see there. So at this point we're good. I'm going to put the lid back on. We'll put the new fuel screen on. I'll clean that off, and we'll put this back on, and our little job is done. Come back. All right, so screws back in, not a major thing. I did kind of push down to compress that spring a little and take a little of the pressure off of the diaphragm, because otherwise the diaphragm's trying to get kind of sucked down into that body a bit. If you push down a little on it and relax the diaphragm, all these little screw holes line up perfectly. So new screen in place. Make sure you clean the junk that the screen trapped out of the body of this thing. Use a little carburetor cleaner and get that all cleaned up. Do that before you put the diaphragm, before you put this piece back on here, because you don't want any carburetor cleaner getting on the diaphragm, because it would be the end of it. So now we just have to put the lid back on, put a new, this comes in the kit, this new little fiber little washer thing to seal this bolt against this lid. There's the old one, in case you're wondering. And that's about it. So we're going to put this back on. Make sure your pipes are oriented thusly is the way I did it, where the little logo is aligned with this spigot. And then we will reinstall it in the car. Alrighty, fuel pump complete, fuel pump back in car, fired up, a little bit of leakage. Just had to tighten up the flathead screws that retain those two halves of the fuel pump together. I'm always a little leery of over tightening things like that because you can easily, strip those screws. But just came back from a test ride and no improvement at all. So, it was a good exercise in rebuilding a fuel pump. It seemed like a likely culprit for what's going on with this car, but it's the exact same thing. Revs great, runs great, goes downhill great, but going uphill, not so great. So anyway, we're back to square one again. I guess it's not square one. We've eliminated many things. The problem is we're getting down to, kind of obscure, strange things at this point. So I guess the good news is if you're in the same boat, keep following along. If you have ideas, please write in the comments down below, and subscribe to find out where this all leads. So next episode will be more troubleshooting on the troubled 356. So until then, I'll see you next time.